Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we're going to hold off a few seconds while everyone filters in. So give us a moment. While everyone's coming in, how are you, James? How are you doing today?
Just gonna work out how to share this on Facebook. I am good. There we go. Shared. I am great, thank you. I'm all right. Well, I'm not great. I'm adequate. I'm like everyone else. Hovering always between a 5 and a 6 out of 10 in lockdown. But fine, thank you.
Absolutely. It's the whole trying to find joy, wanting to hug people.
Yeah, and not feeling guilty about wanting to find joy. I think that's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was talking to the chair of the Arts and Culture Network, actually, who will probably be here somewhere in the audience today. And we said, we're not going to look at a screen ever again once we're out of lockdown. It will last about 10 seconds, but...
Yeah. I think you're allowed to look at television drama and British independent cinema, but that's it. No other screens.
Correct. Heartbreakingly, I made a promise last year. I spent so much money on theatre last year, whilst not being able to afford it, that I was like, 2020, I'm going to try not to go to theatre so much because I just can't afford it. It's just not a lifestyle. Yeah. And now I realize that was a stupid thing to do. Just
now that you can't see it even if you wanted to, it's
exactly.
It's the most important point any of us can ever make, that it's just not affordable enough yet for the majority of people.
Yeah, there is definitely, and we'll talk about this, so we'll get into the conversation in a second, but there is definitely a point between being about 24 and 30 where you don't qualify for the student discount anymore, so you have to like pay cash. But the more you watch, the more you want to see the good plays, and those are more expensive, so there's definitely a squeeze there. Yeah,
and there used to be government schemes to encourage and finance and take the burden off that, and each individual theatre sometimes has their own individual scheme, but it needs to be more coordinated, and there's work to be done for sure.
Absolutely. All right, well, now that I can see the numbers coming up, so we will start with the questions. I'll do a little introduction. So welcome everyone, especially those that are not familiar with the Young Fabians. Thank you for joining us. The Young Fabians are the under 31 branch of the Fabian Society, which is a progressive think tank and I believe the oldest progressive think tank in the UK, and a co-founder of the Labour Party. So we've got a long, fruitful history in the left-wing movement in the UK. We have been holding a huge amount daily events during lockdown and much before that, and this is one that I'm particularly excited about. We're welcoming James Graham, who is now, I think, very famous screenwriter and playwright, who has written works such as This House, Brexit and Uncivil War, Quiz, the latest TV show, X and Y. I was looking at your back catalogue, and this is wonderful and really diverse. This Vote, we'll also talk about that. And we will be talking both about your work and how passionately people feel about your work, and how much it's introduced them to politics, or just let them enjoy politics outside of the reality of politics, and but also about theatres and how the arts are having to respond, are being hit by COVID and the economic crisis around it, how we might find a way forward. I think the fact that you went on Question Time shows how strongly you feel about it, I think. So yes, and for those of you who stay until the end of the chat, we will talk about how you can get more involved. Hopefully this conversation will entice you to get more involved with us. So, James, hi. I have seen a lot of interviews that you've done recently, and they delve a lot into your background. You come from Nottinghamshire, from Mansfield. You come from a mining town, from a fairly working class background, and kind of from the trade union movement on the sidelines. So there's been a lot of talk about that, and it's all super interesting. But I'm very interested to know how you started theatre has got a reputation for being quite elitist, very London-centric, very exclusive. So I'm very interested in that kind of period between sort of 17 and 25 when you're trying to make a name for yourself.
Yeah, it's entirely through education, which is one of the many depressing aspects of the current condition we find ourselves in. I think actually previously arts education about 10, 15 years ago was pretty good. And it was, of course, it was the great leveller. It meant that any student, comprehensive school or public school, had access to plays, performing in school plays, being in a school band, going to the theatre. And that's what got it for me. I didn't grow up a theatre family apart from panto, probably like a lot of your participants. That was pantomime was my uniquely British and slightly odd way into theatre, but I loved it. I absolutely adored it. And but I never imagined a career in the arts. I thought I was going to be a teacher. My parents worked in local government. And I just had this amazing drama teacher who, in a non-bullying way, suggested I go on the stage a little bit and perform in plays. And there was just a philosophy. There was a philosophy in my comprehensive school of working class boys and girls doing theatre and not being scary, not being elitist, not being soft. So he got the head of the football team to be Romeo and popular girls, and then people like me to support them. And so I just fell in love with that. I fell in love with fundamentally the liveness of it. And I think growing up in towns like that, and this is certainly true now, there were diminishing levels of social infrastructure outside of pubs and working men's clubs, and even they're all gone now. So there weren't many opportunities to actually be with your neighbours in a way that you're sharing something. So school plays were just brilliant. I just couldn't believe that hundreds of people would come from the town and watch the kids, and just to be physically in a space with your community felt like a really valuable thing, and so different to watching TV on your own at home. So for whatever reason, a group of us just got so passionate about theatre that we went on to have the first ever A-level in our school for drama, and then we went up to university. I went to the University of Hull and continued it there. Yeah. And it was and then I started to learn to write, basically to get off stage a little bit and really enjoy the private experience of writing and sharing work. And then I can talk in more detail if it's useful, but then you go through, like everybody, when you leave education, there's a bit of an interim period where you're not quite sure what you're going to do. I went back and moved into my childhood bedroom. I got a job working backstage at a theatre in Nottingham, but just use that period to really try and learn to write and commit to writing a few plays and sending those off to, as you said, to places in London I'd never heard of that sounded really glamorous, like Earl's Court. And I just sent plays off, play after play after play, and then got the slightest nibble from a very small fringe pub theatre called the Finborough, and that started that relationship and carried on from there.
That's wonderful. I was looking through some of your early work. I couldn't really find anything about Tory boys, but how did that play come about? Because it sounds wonderful and something I'd want to watch.
I feel like a traitor. Sorry, yeah. The play was Tory Boys, and it was about young Tories who do exist apparently, and yeah, no, it came from. I suppose I always try and. I'm always interested in the less familiar figures or the less familiar aspects of what feels like a very public, very familiar world, which is politics. And I had I knew a couple of people from university, from Hull University, who were young, sort of working class, and gay, and conservatives. And I sort of never put those things together as ever being a person that was possible. So I was just fascinated by it, and I always try to, despite my own politics, try and go and meet people different from myself who think differently from me. And so I went to meet them. They introduced me to a whole world of socializing and structures and organizations around young gay conservatives, working in Parliament as researchers or as activists in the party. And at the time, so Gordon Brown, I think, was Prime Minister, and this was for a national youth theatre. So it actually didn't feel hugely controversial to be looking at the opposition that may one day become the government, and to try and, through younger characters, put those ideas on stage.
Fantastic. What is the play about? As I say, there isn't much out there, unfortunately, on.
I was probably about 10 years old, 10 years ago. So so yeah, I was still sort of starting out. It looks at some conservative researchers for members of parliament, young researchers and advisors as was the opposition in the late 2000s, and I guess it took one character who was struggling a bit with both his political identity and his sexual identity, and the tensions between those two things. And it was a play for young people. It was for the National Youth Theatre, and it's for an audience of young people. So it kind of tried to, in a tender, empathetic way, look at how sometimes your identity and your politics sometimes might be at war, and what it is to be young and political.
Yeah, that is fantastic, and there are so many stories. We were talking just before we went online. There are just so many stories of like young activists, young politicos. They will fill biographies and autobiographies.
Yeah, I'm sure. but this is why it's so exciting to be speaking to you guys, because it's the traditional canvas of political dramas. We all know what it is. It's all impossibly quite old, very middle class, very white, very male. And it sounds creaky, and it's in Gothic palaces with wood paneling. And I've always just been really incredibly keen to show what is the different side of politics from that, whether it's the age or whether it's taking it out of Westminster into local constituencies, whether it's about party activism rather than government, and those kind of things.
I'm curious, when did you start writing about politics specifically? Was it at university? Was it outside? Was it did something prompt you to get into it?
Yeah, it was a perfectly fine 3-star play that I wrote for my first ever Edinburgh Fringe show. So I just took it up with some student friends, and I chose as the subject matter the miners' strike, but specifically the miners' strike from a Nottinghamshire perspective, which is very different from other counties in the country. It's much more divided, and trying to find, I just begin, consciously or not, realizing that I was trying to empathize with both sides of that debate on the left about staying out or going back. But that was just because it was a local story for me. I don't think I set out thinking I was going to be a political playwright. And actually I don't even know if I am a political playwright. I'm a playwright who is mildly obsessed with politics and putting that on screen or stage. But there is a debate to be had, probably not a very interesting one here right now, but a debate about what is political theatre. It doesn't just mean theatre that is about politics. Theatre can be political in any number of ways. Political about where you stage it, or who gets to see it, or who's making it and who it's for. Absolutely. And what form is, what the content, what the style is. So it's, but no, it wasn't I didn't leave university and go, right, political play, I'm going to take on David Hare and knock him off his pedestal. It was just emerged. Just too many exciting worlds and stories for me to not be interested in politics, I
think. That is a wonderful segue, actually, to the next question. So your work tends to talk about key points in political history. I'm reminded, for example, of This House, which talks about the Labour government in the 70s that had, I think it was a majority of 3. And so it spent its entirety trying to negotiate, and the story focuses on the Whip's office. So there's all of these like great moments, like Brexit and then Civil War, of real drama. So it looks to me, when I look at the work that you have done, that you really focus on stories, on the people, on the those interactions, those key kind of points. But I kind of wanted to ask you about policy, because obviously the Young Fabians and the Fabian Society at large, we really like to talk about policy, right? Like nationalization and like, all things that are really emotional, like in Section 28. And I wonder how much specific aspects of like maybe really dry legislation, like whether Hansard is a thing that does pique your interest, or actually, those are accessory to people, right? To those playing those parts.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think both. I think it's possible for both. I sort of accept and I've found peace with the idea that I am a massive dweeb for systems and processes. And I guess I have a belief that sometimes the best way to access the bigger stuff that you're talking about, which is really important, the ideological stuff, the about principles and who we want to be and how we can be that country. I feel like by getting into the minutiae of rituals and systems, like looking at opening the Swiss watch and looking how it all works, I feel like that is a weird way to sort of get to magnify that stuff. You start small and you get big. So the joy of writing this house was I just realized I just didn't know how Parliament worked. I saw all the big ideological debates about less state intervention, more state intervention, but I didn't know how whipping worked. I didn't know how they voted. I didn't know, do you go left, do you go right for yes or no? Do they count? Who counts you? Does everyone have their own office, or do you share an office? And these things seem really small, but I think they are so illuminating when you put them under a microscope in terms of what they say about the general nature of your democracy. So, and when you push that system to the extremes, as the 1974 to 79 Parliament did, for particularly the Labour Party, you often arrive at absurdity. You arrive at a place of absolute farce because you're pushing a system's principles to the limit. So a system, and we'll have all seen the crazy queues around Westminster Hall this week, because in our system you vote with your body.
There's a play there. There's a play there waiting to happen.
Yeah, maybe like a really bad Radio 4 play where people just talk in the queue about.
Yeah.
But so that's absurd. But in because we have a system where you have to vote with your body and you have to be there, and there are pluses and minuses to that, which I think a play is a space where you can tell those stories. It's really beautiful that we say, if you're going to vote on something that's really important to citizens or really controversial, if you're going to vote to go to war, you turn up and you look people in the eye when you're making that decision.
Yeah.
So that's the beautiful bit of it. The absurd side of it is when you get a pregnant MP being wheeled into the House of Commons chamber because a cesarean has been cancelled. That's ludicrous. And in between the beautiful and the ludicrous is probably where we should be sitting.
Yeah.
So I just love that. For whatever reason, I love the day-to-day absurdities of looking at a system, and how that might magnify the bigger stuff. But then I think, sorry to go on for ages, but I think in Brexit on civil war, it was just striking that balance between what is a referendum campaign, or how does that work? Who rents the offices? Who gets the chairs? Is there a whiteboard? Who comes up with the messages? How do you message people on social media with the big existential questions of who are we? Is this going to destroy us? And I think the best dramas probably balance both.
Yeah, you must have read the Nick Clegg autobiography thing that he did, where he described how like your office makes all of the difference in how you're able to do your job in Parliament, and he like goes into quite a lot of detail as to like how screwed you can get depending on how bad your office is, and how unable to do your job because like you won't get reception and it's terrible and there's no space, and like it's weirdly fascinating and worrying.
Well, do you remember I find it really fascinating. Do you remember when Gordon Brown he decided he was going to leave number 10 and go into number 12 into the Whip's office and do a big open plan kind of New York Mayor Bloomberg setup?
God, no.
In a tour to New York, and he'd seen that, and for him the architecture of having an open plan office was more his style than being in a small private office. But okay. I mean, of course it makes a difference, and it's interesting stuff.
It's fascinating. Now, it would be remiss for me to mention it. So we're recording this on Friday, the 5th of June. We have seen now 2 weeks of protests in the US in the middle of a pandemic about the murder of George Floyd, about racial tensions, inequalities. Again, kind of what you were saying about really stretching the limits of the system is what Donald Trump is doing as president, considered to be authoritarian behavior. We don't know. And then there's also the overspill into how we see that in the UK. And I really wanted your take on it, because the arts and culture is such a strong part of how we perceive reality.
Yeah.
The arts have a real problem with diversity in the UK. We know that. And I don't think this is a subject that you have tackled head on yet. So I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts are on the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation that's happening right now, and urgently so, because um, I'm just a big believer in the power of art and storytelling to platform voices and stories that get ignored, and there's no question that has been too slow a process. You know, I can talk about my class background and believing that I deserve my platform for that reason, and obviously class intersects with race and gender and faith as well. There has been progress made, but progress only been made because of grassroots campaigning in theatre and people being loud about it and pushing the industry leaders to program that work and get those plays on. And it was slowly improving, but certainly not to the extent that it was that what was on stage was comparable to what our makeup is nationwide. But it was getting better, and so I suppose the problem is that my fear now. I know we'll talk about arts funding later, but in the midst of the crisis that we're about to experience, the likelihood is that those voices that were just entering are the most vulnerable to the sustained damage to their ability to have an artistic career. That those voices disappear, yeah. So it's how as an industry we can just recognise that and make sure that those are the voices that we protect. But it's, you know, it's everybody's. It's to everyone's loss that we don't have enough of those stories. It's both amazing and horrifically shameful that I think it was last year, this incredible writer, Natasha Gordon, was the first Black British playwright to have a play in the West End. This incredible show called 9 Nights, just a beautiful look at a Caribbean family's grief. And it sold out at the National, and it had a new audience that would never normally come to that intimidating concrete building. And it was both a commercial hit, a critical hit, an emotional hit. And so, yeah, it's just devastating that it took so long, but finally that barrier was broken. So in terms of individual responsibilities, I guess we just have to be the ones who either amplify those voices or step aside when we feel like we're the ones in the way.
Absolutely. And obviously the debate continues, and yeah. we'll be carrying it on as young Fabians and much beyond. I encourage everyone who's listening to this to go watch an interview that you did with Alistair Campbell. I don't know who was interviewing who last year at Edinburgh. It was a great kind of conversation. And I think at some point he sort of like tells you off for like him not being in the room in some scene. Is very amusing. So I wonder to ask, because I think you've spoken before about writing about real people and then real people who are alive and quite famous. But I am interested. I was looking at how you wrote a play about the monster raving loony party, and the guy found it.
I've thought about that for years. Well done. That's amazing.
It was just, and it made me think like. It does seem that you managed to write about almost anything that takes your fancy, which is rare. Like a lot of playwrights feel like they can't write about the things that they want to do. So I wonder what is the wonkiest thing, or the thing that you've tried to put a play on, but maybe the producers, the writers have been like, nah, like no one's going to come watch that.
Oh, that's a really good question. There must have been. And actually sometimes people say no, and then it ends up happening. So,
okay.
Excuse me, I remember doing I did a play by Rupert Murdoch called Ink, which was at the Almeida Theatre, and then it moved to Broadway last year. That started off, I pitched that like 10 years before, and everyone just went, no, we're not really interested in that. So sometimes you have to wait for the moment, or sometimes you have to prove yourself in a different field as a writer before people trust you with the really controversial stuff. I like the word wonky. I think I get a sort of mischievous pleasure from taking things that on paper sound like the dullest evening you could imagine in a theatre, or completely irrelevant to the condition we're living through at the moment, and just making it either as entertaining or as relevant as possible. So like this house wasn't guaranteed. I mean, people would really, I'd love to say I had to fight my way through it. I was supported in doing that. But we, opened in the smallest space in the National Theatre at first, because everyone was like, well, it's basically a play about legislation not passing in the 1970s slowly. And you go, it's not the new Hamilton, is it? But it's for whatever reason, we managed to catch a popular audience and it moved to bigger spaces and then the West End. So that gave me confidence that there is an audience out there that maybe was underappreciated previously for incredibly political work about the process of politics. Monster Raving Loony, I just, so that was about, the creator and leader of what at the time he became the longest leader of any political party in British history, albeit to no other great success. He was the guy who invented this culture of standing on the stage at the count, wearing a silly costume next to the leader of the party. And people can roll their eyes, and I frequently do myself, but his basic point was that there's a great tradition in that, in the court jester, where you always remind the people in power how fragile it is, and to mock them and to laugh at them and to make them uncomfortable is the kind of public service. So to look at, exactly. He first stood in 1963 against Profumo, I think, or because of the Profumo by-election, then stood all the way up to Tony Blair. And so it just felt like a really askew way, like a Forrest Gump way, to look at 40, 30 years of political history, but literally from the sidelines, the guy who watched from the side. That just felt really, I don't know, kind of strangely magical to me.
It is. There should be a part 2 about Lord Buckethead.
There could be a sequel, who I've met, and I'm sure he would grab me some.
Fascinating. There's sort of a conversation about how relevant theatre is in general, how exclusive, how broad. I happen to work in the film industry, but I also engage a lot with things like NT Live and so on. So the transfer of theatre onto cinema, which I think is quite interesting. But I'm interested in knowing from you mediums that you haven't really engaged with. Sorry, I did not make an announcement on the Q&A. I will do so in a second. Just maybe social media platforms, like just forms of channels of engagement that you may not have engaged with. I'm thinking obviously of younger people. Political TikToks. I don't know. Have you been approached? Is this something that you've considered, or do you like the slightly longer form, people in a room physically, only paying attention to that one thing?
I do. I tried to mix up the form in this, what is one of the oldest mediums in the world, theatre. I did a play, this would be a name drop, with Daniel Radcliffe in New York, called Privacy, which encouraged the audience to keep their phones on during the show, and they would send us things throughout the show, and we would compile their data, and it would change the outcome of the show. So stupid things like there's sort of a verbatim play as well as a drama. I interviewed loads of people and then put those words in the play. So we interviewed someone from Vogue magazine, and they taught the audience how to take the perfect selfie. So that was great. We got an entire audience to take a selfie, and then we got them to email those selfies into the show. And then in the second act, once we compiled them, we showed them all on a big screen, and we showed how we can strip the metadata from those photos and learn things about their phones and location and things like that. So that was, albeit a very traditional art form, theatre, I think there are ways you can acknowledge and accept that different technology exists now. But I suppose if I'm being really honest, I've always resisted this idea that, I love TikToks, who doesn't love TikToks? But I've always resisted this idea that that a younger audience attention span is only like 5-10 minutes long. When I first started writing for TV 10 years ago, all producers were talking about was 5-minute short films on YouTube. And I just think the opposite has been proven. How many box sets have you consumed in lockdown that go on for 12, 15 hours? With all the other stuff does that better. If you want to communicate in bursts, we have social media, we have TikTok, we have Snapchat. To engage in a story over a longer period of time, whereby your brain adjusts to a different frequency, I think that is the power of drama. And we shouldn't sort of apologize for that. We should sort of go, no, you're going to be here for 3 hours and you're going to listen. And I decide,
commit.
Yeah, exactly. Commit to it.
I could not agree more. Are you a podcast person? I always ask people this. Do you listen to audio?
I love it. I know because I can't stand jogging, and I also don't want to ruin all my favorite songs by listening to them when I jog.
Yeah.
So I do podcasts, and I do political histories. I'm going through. I'm actually going through trying to find it. I'm listening to a BBC documentary series about previous Labour prime ministers. So I've just got through Ramsay MacDonald, and I'm on to I've done Clement, and I'm on to I think Howard Wilson now. It's great. I love running across a river listening to debates about tax and spend. I think it's great.
Yeah, and it is a prime example of people appreciating longer form. Like 2-hour podcasts are normal now, and people definitely commit to them.
And actually, what I think is so exciting about podcasts, which is different to theatre actually, is there is an intimacy. There's such an intimacy there, that little voice speaking softly into your ear. It feels very weirdly private. And I would say theatre does that as well, but weirdly theatre's power is obviously it's public. It's big, and you're declaring and you're sharing something. But yeah, they both. Yeah, it's great. I love them.
Fantastic. Right. So just so we don't lose pace, we'll go a little bit more into politics. I should have mentioned at the beginning. My apologies. I am new to the format. So we are going to be doing a Q&A at the end. So I think some people have already started sending some of their questions. So please send your questions on the little Q&A button that you've got here, and you can upvote other people. So I've got them by order of upvoting. So we'll be answering those at the end. So thanks for sending them. If there are any ladies in the audience, we want your questions. We have only men. Oh no, we've got a few ladies coming now. Perfect. Great. So obviously, I put this in the context of your appearance on Question Time. If any of you guys haven't seen James yet, he was on the 21st of May, Question Time. You can find it on iPlayer, talking about the value of theatre and just the fact that it may disappear. It'd be great for you to talk a little bit about actually the fragility of business models and the economics of theatre, because I think a lot of people just don't realize you see like big building in West End and you think, well, this has been here forever and it will be here forever. And actually, God, if you talk to any actor, they'll tell you just how wafer thin the margins are. So I'm interested in both what you think of the situation now, but also what was wrong with the situation before, because I don't think theatre was in a super healthy place either before we started.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Carrie, that the problem with making this public argument, and why I was close to crapping myself going on Question Time, was these are really hard arguments to make, especially against the back of a devastating global pandemic where every sector, everyone's family, everyone's job is suffering. And the last thing I think any of us in the industry who is lucky enough to maybe have a voice wanted to avoid is very wealthy celebrity actors appearing on screen going, give us your money, give us your money. So the approach to this particular crisis, and there will always be a funding crisis, I think is tried to be different. It has the image of glass and wealth. You go to a Western theatre, the wine is 10 quid and there's gold gilded on the balcony, and programs are expensive, and the demographic of the audience leans towards a certain kind of person too often. But you're right. I mean, what's the most upsetting aspect of this whole thing, whereby theatres were almost the very first, in fact, I think they were probably the very first building to close, and they will absolutely be the very last building to open. So it's not that theatre is special, it is the worst affected sector, it is the worst affected industry in the world. And if we want to keep it, it will require an intervention to do that. But if we are going to have an intervention, then it is incumbent upon us also to have a reset for the reasons that you're implying, that you can't just return to form because that form wasn't perfect. But just to echo what you said, it's I didn't do any writing for like 2 weeks after they closed so immediately, because I think we all as a community were just so worried for each other. And I knew, hundreds of actor friends in particular, who, even though we think they live these very privileged lives, the majority they are overwhelmingly freelance. They go from job to job. They often live hand to mouth. That money of that job pays the rent for that month. and it's incredibly precarious industry, and to lose 6 months' work without planning is well, you without any help, they would have been plunged into poverty.
I mean, especially because there is no alternative to go work in a pub, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. With everything closed, I mean, I know a lot of writer, director, designer friends who went and tried to get jobs in obviously in the growth industries like supermarkets and warehouses, and many people did that. But yeah, but the majority of people were stuck on zero income, and the danger is because we will be closed the longest. You lose all these incredibly gifted, incredibly skilled people that were an incredible amount of personal investment, but also state and industry investment has worked on them becoming world-class craftspeople. Will just have to leave the sector because they can't if theatres don't open till next spring, no one can tolerate living on zero income for that long, so they'll just leave, and understandably so. Why should they put up with that? So that's the worrying thing. But you're not wrong in that if it's 50-50 that the cultural landscape will survive in any recognizable form at the moment. If it does, it's what an opportunity to get it right into the DNA of it and start fixing things for the better.
Just to point to a proposal that you put forward. So I'm reading here from the magazine The Stage. So some of the suggestions made to government include urging theatres to postponing rather than cancelling shows, asking theatres to share with creatives any donations received from ticket sales for cancelled plays, ensuring the new plays commissioned to be broadcast during lockdown are paid for. And I really do want to ask you more about digital economies, offering playwrights compensation for loss of royalty, encouraging new commissions and the production of new plays, and so on and so forth. So there's a real plea to government, but there seems to be also like a directionality, like to employers within theatre. What's your experience been of theatres? Have they been very willing to kind of keep the show going behind closed doors, or is it kind of very much like there's nothing going on, goodbye until?
No, not at all. There are challenges to that because obviously to protect a lot of the people who work in theatre, they've had to be furloughed, and to get their money they can't work. So you have to make sure that you're not asking for people to do things that would damage their ability to get the government help. So the workforce is diminished. But no, I mean, one of the I've been lucky enough to be slightly involved in the conversation with government over the past 10 days or so since Question Time. And I guess suspecting that one of the things that a Conservative government can never quite ideologically tolerate is the idea of giving people a check to sit at home and do nothing. I think they will always struggle with that concept, even though, as we know, that's not what the money is for. So we've rightly been trying to champion what theatre companies, artists and institutions have been doing in lockdown, which is not just sat there doing nothing. There have been incredible stories of education departments working with schools going, well, if we can't open our theatres, let's use our acting talent, let's use our directors, designers, writers to work via these kind of platforms to speak to kids and do lessons and workshops in the way that we always would done. I was speaking to my local theatre, the Nottingham Playhouse, yesterday. They're holding open auditions for talent, music talent, acting talent across the county for free for the first time ever. So there were things. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but those conversations are happening about what is our civic role as a community organisation if we can't currently open. And then there's all the planning. People aren't moping going, oh, we can't open. There is a desire to open as soon as possible, and to do that requires months and months of planning. So people are there's kind of a sort of sadness to it because the likeliness of it happening is so slim. But people are getting ready for Panto at Christmas. They're designing those sets. They're casting. They are working out where to get the costume and all the sequins and what music to buy. It won't be Panto as we know it, but that work is happening so that if the government go beyond what we possibly expect them to do at the moment and go, yes, we think this has a social and economic value, we want you to survive, here's an emergency relief fund. We can do exactly what they want all businesses to do and hit the ground running and become part of that really positive story of recovery. So yeah, things are happening.
And thank God for that. Now, in terms of who should be helping out, obviously we talk about government. There's been a sort of an immediate allocation from the AC, from the Arts Council of England, of 160 million pounds, but then at the same time they've kind of suspended their grants, so some people will be losing out. So it's whether that is new money or not. But one thing that has become clear to me is how much big streamers, so whether it's YouTube, whether it's Netflix, whether it's Amazon Prime, just how much they benefit from theatre work, from theatre creatives, honing and developing people. Should they not be around the table? Should the government not get those guys to sit down and commit some money? I think Netflix pledged $150 million in the US to help crew. I'm never quite sure how much money actually sifts through. Is that something that is being considered? Is that something that there's appetite for?
It should absolutely be something that's happening. It's not punishment. It's not punishment to these platforms to go, you have earned more money during this crisis and we have lost a significant amount of money. I think it is an acknowledgement that is based in absolute truth that the entire cultural ecosystem feeds off each other. And it actually, weirdly, in Britain, almost more than any other country, certainly more than America, where, as you'll probably be aware, it's very coastal. You have Hollywood on the west and theatre on the east, and often never the two shall meet. What's glorious about this country is that everything feeds into everything else. It is not a coincidence that one of the biggest global shows in the past couple of years is Fleabag, written by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, which I saw above a pub 5-6 years ago for no money, and then now she's bringing work to the UK and taking Amazon and to new heights, and it's Barack Obama's favorite show. That's great, and we should celebrate that. That is a national success story. Above and beyond what it does, just to be able to witness incredible stories and beautiful work that makes you laugh and distracts you in difficult times. So yes, it's true. I mean, I don't know whether you're right. Netflix did pledge some money to I think it was specifically for their shows and things that were in shutdown in the meantime. But I mean, 150 million, if you want to get into the numbers of it, it's, I think the shortfall in UK theatres is about 600 million if we go from beginning to end, which to me and you is like made up money. That's so huge. But in terms of government spending or private spending from a company like Netflix or Amazon, it's hard to say, but it's basically nothing for what the arts and television and film contributes back. So it would be economically illiterate to decide that the majority of theatre should be mothballed and die for what is such a small amount of money. And there's a direct link from the pub theatre in Earl's Court all the way through to Star Wars that is proven, and it just makes no sense to let it go.
We need to start making calls to these people.
Right, let's do that after this.
Also, there's some bizarre ways in which that doesn't work. Because apparently, NT Live made almost no money out of Fleabag because Phoebe Waller-Bridge is now so famous that her royalties were massive. And you think, can we not meet somewhere in the middle where like everyone can make a relatively decent percentage as they go up the ladder? We're preparing a talk all about this in sort of contractual law because it feels really wrong and backward.
I think that's definitely true, and I think those conversations will happen as a result of this. And it's it shouldn't just be individuals. This will sound like self-promotion. I don't mean it to be this. Is it to prove your
point? For you.
I made a decision when lockdown happened because I was because there's no rhyme or reason to who gets affected the worst. And I just found myself in a position where I actually had some television work that might cover me for that period, whereas another writer was completely screwed. And it's not fair. It makes no sense. It's just the roll of the dice. So I decided that I would donate the commission of the work that I had from Quiz to a freelance fund. and then loads of other people also were doing incredible things, more benevolent than I was, to sort of support the community. But I think it can't be up to the individual to decide that on a case-by-case basis. There needs to be a cultural shift in how we disseminate royalties and wealth. And I'm always nervous about the reason why often writers will get those royalties is because they don't know whenever they're going to earn anything next. They don't know when the next hit play will be. They don't know when the next commission will be. So I certainly didn't want to shame any other writers into feeling like they had to do that because it's so precarious for everybody. But no, you're right. It's yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
How, in an ideal world, so say we got out of COVID and we all go back into theatres, what do you think is a kind of a future of thriving theatre in the UK? It's a very broad question, but like, what are the things that would look different that you see in your day-to-day life that you just like, this isn't right, this should be this other way? I'm thinking here of digital and how to make revenue from that. Okay. But it doesn't have to be that, you know. How do we protect crew? Because they get forgotten. It's not just actors, it's, you know. Yeah. So what are those things that, you know, if you could, you would change and make better?
That's a brilliant question. And if I was a better politician, I would have all those things at my fingertips. But it all feels so impossible at the moment, but I know it won't feel impossible forever. For me, it's all about these buildings. They still feel really sentimental, but it's about and obviously theatre is more than buildings. Theatre is people, and theatre is companies that don't have any physical space. I just think these community buildings, which often are the largest buildings in the city or the town, and often the biggest employer in that community, to remember that theatre is not just come in at 7 o'clock and we'll start the show at 7:30 and then can you please quietly leave. These buildings, in the absence of any other civic or physical spaces in these communities, with the absence of libraries, with the absence of post offices, leisure centres, youth centres, pubs, even in my town, even the pubs can't survive. These are places for people to gather and recognise and identify themselves as being a community. So I would encourage a new culture which exists in London. You mentioned the National, so everyone can walk down the South Bank in London and pop into the National for a cup of coffee. So that's fine, but there needs to be more than that. These are buildings which are thriving with talent and creativity and people, which can exist all day long for mothers who need somewhere to go with their kid, for elderly people who have no company, for debates with the young Fabians to rock up in the foyer or use the space in the afternoon on stage in the Olivier to have a debate. I think these should be civic spaces, and that will maybe go some way to solving what I think is the psychological problem for most people is a barrier to theatre, which the half the country still don't think theatre is for them. They don't think they're welcome. They don't think it's relevant. They don't think they can afford it. They think art is something that is what other people do. When you say the word art, they think of a picture in a museum they haven't seen in the city they haven't visited. And it just doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be that at all.
I'd say this as praise and as compliment. I actually haven't seen Brexit. I know. The reason I haven't seen it is precisely for
you don't want to live through that moment again, probably.
Well, yeah. I don't want to empathize with these people, and I pointedly call it that because I do think I think all the bad things about the referendum, but I felt really strongly that if I watched the film, I would just have to feel empathy. I would just have to, I'd have to understand their point of view, and part of me just was like, I don't want to do that.
I had family members saying, I love you, I'm not going to watch it, and I totally understood. Do you think you'll ever get to a place where you want to engage with people you disagree with?
Yeah. God, I don't know.
And also, like, watching a TV drama shouldn't be something you feel like you have to do. It's not national service, but no, I do understand.
Yeah, no, but it is interesting. It is exactly what you're talking about, like just creating community and contact and just empathy machines. I will read a few of the questions. Wow, people have really gone to town with the questions. So let me just see if I can get. Let's attendees. I'm doing this off the fly, but I'm going to see if I can get the person to actually come on.
Oh, that's exciting. Wow, I've never
yeah,
done that.
it doesn't look like I can do that. I won't do that. Anyway, I'll read that question. So Victoria Parrott, who is the chair of the Arts and Culture Network, really, really wonderful. She's putting through a culture war pamphlet with Dan Wood. She asks, through your TV show quiz, intentionally or not, you definitely reopened the news story about Charles Ingram and to some extent changed public opinion on the entire scandal. Did you realize the power this show was going to have before it aired? And do you think this same power is possible through theatre? And does it matter? So TV versus theatre.
Yeah, great question. No, I had no idea. I really didn't have any idea that the impact of quiz. And of course, one of the impacts, one of the reasons for the impact of quiz is something way beyond my control and incredibly devastating, which is the circumstance in which we locked people in their homes and they wanted to watch some television, and that's nothing to do with me. But what it did do gloriously, and I've talked about this before, is it made. I mean, when we were filming it, my biggest worry that it was going to be too light and too incidental, and then nobody would really care about this 20-year-old story about a game show.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, oh no, I want to be that punchy political playwright who did Brexit, that's really edgy and really, sticking it to the man. And here's an ITV drama about a game show. I hoped, and with talent like the actors that we had and the director that we had, that it would ask wider questions about truth and lies and perception and manipulation in the media. But no, I didn't. I was obviously thrilled that millions of people watched it. It was a deliberate intention to get people to question their perceived notions of this story in an exercise that I hoped was meant to demonstrate. When I remember the trial in 2003, and I thought he was completely banged to rights based on the evidence that was presented to me in a very black and white way. Only once I went back and started re-examining it and meeting all the people, did I realize how much of it was coincidental and how many leaps people had to take to get to the narrative that they wanted, which was that these were bad guys who did a bad thing. I think it's much more complicated than that. I'm not saying they didn't do it. I'm not saying they did do it. I'm simply saying that it absolutely is ludicrous to think of this as being black and white. Yep. So that was a deliberate exercise I wanted the audience to engage with. Can theatre do that? Absolutely, on a less huge scale. But I think theatre's power is different. I think television's reach is its power. It can absolutely unite an entire nation around a piece of drama. Theatre can only play to a number of people every single night, but I think the impact of that single night is more powerful as an experience by being there, by sharing the same oxygen as the people who are sharing the work, by being in a community as you experience it. So there is a disposability a bit to television. And I think theatre really stays with you sometimes plays can stay with you for the rest of your life.
Although the previous criticism of theatre, which is that it is ephemeral, that it sort of disappears, isn't true anymore. So your play, This House, was played, was on YouTube for the whole of last week via NT Live. I'm a very small niche of the puppet. I'm not representative, but all my friends watched it. I watched it again, and it's glorious. It's glorious, and it does. I've got another question about Tory Boys, but it did make me really want to see your plays. I was like, my brain's so attuned to streaming that I was like, where can I click to watch these plays? I just want to go back and watch them. So hopefully that will start happening with new plays. I believe technology on streaming and theatres is improving, and so.
Actually, the biggest fear when NT Live started, it would scream plays live into cinemas across the country, that it would make people not go to the theatre. They'd just go to the Odeon and see the filming of it because it's probably cheaper and maybe it's closer. But the statistics don't bear that out. People go and watch a play on either, and hopefully watch it at home on YouTube during lockdown, and it makes them want to go and see live theatre. So we shouldn't. It's not competing. We should absolutely embrace. There would have been no excuse during this pandemic to not reach into people's homes and give work for free and go, just take it, just have it and see what you think, take a risk.
I would have paid for it as well. Like if, you know, I'll be happy for them to have a streaming platform that I can pay for. So Henry Mendoza, who is in our BAME advocacy group and works in arts and culture, works in theatre as well. He's asking, how did the second production of Tory Boys come about? My friend and fellow NYTer?
Yeah, National Youth Theatre.
No, of course, National Youth Theatre, silent. I was thinking New York Times. Silent and starred in the second production in 2013. So,
hi, Henry. Was it Henry or Harry? Sorry.
Henry, yeah.
Yes. Hi, Henry. Thank you. That came about because I think it was purely because it was a play that when we wrote. When I wrote it, I think it was 2007, 2008, the Conservative Party were in opposition, and it was all about the existential crisis. Well, I think in the past, the Conservatives have had two existential crisis issues, Europe and gayness, and they've never really reconciled either. But they were in opposition, they were trying to do that. David Cameron was trying to come across as really socially liberal. So then I think we probably did it again in 2013, 2014 in the West End, again with the National Youth Theatre, but we revived it because the conversations around equal marriage were happening in the Conservative Party, and we could see them once again engaged in this civil war about what was right and what was wrong in that regard. So I think the issue just felt like it was worthy of coming back.
That is very true. That if anybody is ever tempted, once we go back to some kind of normality, to see what Tory gayness looks like, go to Players on a Friday night. And if you've been, you know.
I'll see you there.
Hey. Joe Oliver asked, have you had any contact at all with Dominic Cummings since Brexit and Uncivil War? Did you get any idea what he thought of the depiction of himself? Obviously, I'm not implying he's visited you in person the last few weeks.
No, I live too close to him, if anything. He wouldn't.
Exactly. You're not in Durham.
I know. I have had some contact with him, yes. So my contact with him when we were researching the show, I interviewed everybody, interviewed on the Remain side and on Leave side, politicians, activists. So I probably spent 2 sessions with Dominic Cummings, one in a group of the Vote Leave people, which was interesting to see how that group dynamic worked, and the thing I was really surprised about was not surprised, but what I took from it distinctly was the level of loyalty that team had for him, given that, as we hopefully showed in the drama and you're witnessing in real life, there is a level of social abrasiveness and dismissiveness about how that man operates. But so it was interesting to see a group of people who were not reverent about him. They take the piss, but they were absolutely loyal to him as a person, and so he can clearly generate that amongst people, including clearly the Prime Minister. And I went to his house and I sat with him and looked through some of his explanations of how the data streaming worked in terms of how he messaged on Facebook, and then sort of in a weird kind of blind date way introduced Benedict Cumberbatch to him, and then left them to it, and a night together, not a night together, don't print that. They had an evening together where obviously Benedict, who is an ardent Remainer, sat with a Leaver for a few hours and just talked. I've never heard, sorry.
No, it's funny that you described Dominic Cummings as a Leaver, because I've never actually known whether he actually believes in this thing.
That's a really good question. I think he does. I think he has a higher mission, which is a domestic mission about revolutionizing Whitehall and the civil service and domestic politics. But I do think I think he found European bureaucracies, he would see it frustrating enough a reason to leave it. But that other people would dispute that. So no, actually, weirdly, he's never told me what he thought of it. No, I haven't asked, and he hasn't told me. We've emailed a couple of times on various subject matters, including arts funding, which I was trying to bump up the list of the arts education in schools, because he was Michael Gove's special advisor, and that the consequences of those reforms meant that arts have completely disappeared from the main curriculum. I was trying to get that up the agenda, and he was listening to that a bit, but then the world changed, and here we are.
Absolutely. If anyone watching is interested in reading something that's fascinating, but only to the wonkest of wonks, the Fabian Society produced an arts education report last year by Ben Cooper. Really interesting stuff. I mean, I couldn't agree more, right? Like, you start at a young age, and you just take it with you your whole life. Did he confirm that he watched it then? Did he watch Brexit?
He hasn't actually confirmed he watched it. I think he I was in touch quite a lot during the broadcast, but he said he didn't want to watch it live. I know he read some of the reviews. He said he was going to watch it eventually, but I have no idea.
Some people mocked Benedict Cumberbatch, but actually his accent is perfect, as we saw then when Cummings gave his speech. I thought Cumberbatch had absolutely nailed the accent.
I mean, Dominic, it's so frustrating that their names are so similar. I nearly said Dominic Cumberbatch. Benedict Cumberbatch, I thought did a really, we received and we welcomed it because we wanted, I'm a big believer that these national dramas should be public squares where people gather around and they debate things, but in a different kind of way than from social media. So we welcomed people going, I disagree, I agree, but we received a lot of very public scrutiny and criticism for presenting him, as some people perceived, as this kind of maverick genius who was very Sherlocky in a Benedict way. And I always fundamentally disagree with that. That is how he performs, Dominic Cummings. He is incredibly verbose. He likes to make these often quite intellectually obscure references to military history and political theory. And it may be absolute nonsense. There may be nothing behind it at all, or he may be a strategic wonder. I have no idea, and Benedict had no idea. But that is how he speaks, and those who celebrate him adore it. Those who hate him hate it. Yeah. And we tried to create a space that sort of owned that. So we had characters going, "Oh my God, he's a genius! He's going to win this referendum single-handedly," and then I had people going, "No, it's absolute bollocks! Like it's nonsense."
Yeah.
And nor should I know the answer. That's not for me to say. That's for us to present, and then you, the audience, kind of make that interpretation.
He should have gone to Specsavers. That's all I'm saying.
That's all a sight for sore eyes, which I really
enjoy. Bethany Steventon Crinks asked, she says, I'm working in regional theatre and have secured funding for a project, and we're struggling to make sure that the project isn't made up of only white people. We're struggling as the conservatoire in our city is, although the city isn't very white, so the people graduating are by default also white. How do we as theatre makers make sure that we are allies and not part of the problem? So these guys look like they don't have all that much choice.
That's such an important conversation, isn't it? And I think it requires strategic interventions. It won't happen by accident, and the river is flowing that way, and it requires putting something in the middle of the river and doing something different in terms of outreach, in terms of saying no to people, including people like me. People should say no to me sometimes. And also I both understand and get nervous about the idea of quotas for that reason, because some communities. It's about creating just equal opportunities, isn't it, for access? And some communities are very white, and if you can't apply the same rule for Scotland as you can for London, which is now majority non-white, and London shouldn't be happy with just 12% black or minority ethnic representation. They need to be way bigger than that. So it's how you create a national strategy that takes in how different communities are. In terms of your individual situation, I mean, God knows, and I really sympathise and I really admire your sincere desire to intervene and not just let the normal system just happen by default. I can only imagine it's finding ways, community access ways and networks to reach people, to tell them to come, to meet, to audition, to email, to message, and engage sincerely in those conversations, but it won't happen by default. You have to disrupt that to make it happen.
Yeah, the sometimes the experience we have in the young Fabians is people are shy, and that doesn't have a race or gender barrier, but sometimes there's certain groups that just take asking 3 or 4 or 5 times.
Right.
So
yeah,
I kind of feel that all the time, which is like, especially like some female friends of mine, it's like, just go do this thing, and there's a sort of perennial sense of being underqualified, which is just not true. So Henry again, he asked another question. I loved Labour of Love. I remember hearing that you had to completely rewrite it in the wake of the 2017 election. What was the original version like? How did it end? What's the process like of having to rapidly rewrite a play already commissioned and in rehearsal?
Yeah, I'm just remembering that. Just give me a second while I deal with the trauma of that. That was so strange, because it wasn't just about rewriting dialogue or a scene. That the entire proposition of the play collapsed at 10 p.m. on the night of that election, because and I understand why Theresa May didn't think of playwrights when she called that snap election, but it was very selfish of her. We'd cast it, we'd got the script, we were about to enter rehearsals, and the original play, the structure of the play is that it took every election pretty much from 92 to 2015, and there was a scene for every election, and it started in the most recent one, it started in 2015, and then went backwards in Act 1, and then forwards again in Act 2, back to the current day. So apart from 2015 not being the last election, as you will remember, 2015 was a devastating election for the Labour Party, especially after 5 years of unpopular Conservative austerity. And it was about to enter a huge existential and philosophical debate about who is it for, who should be in it. So that was the world that the play was meant to insert itself into, a big debate about who are we in a moment of statistical decline, particularly in communities where I was writing, which was my hometown of Ashfield. And then 2017 happened, and as you will remember, the story was then on a huge upswing, and the Labour Party did better than anyone ever thought. There was a great sense of optimism from certain sections of the party, and Theresa May was in a tailspin, and it was the Conservatives who were in crisis. So I didn't even know what the note was. I sat there at 2 minutes past 10 going, I don't even know what the rewrite is, because it's the whole basis for the play has changed.
Yeah.
So the only thing I could really think to do was to try and make it less specific to a time and more timeless, because as you will all, I'm sure, probably agree, to our shame, the Labour movement does operate on quite a cyclical basis of optimism, hope, denial, pessimism, self-destruction, rebuilding. That will always be timeless. So I just sort of try to make it more about what is it about the left at home and abroad that often doesn't have complete confidence in the way that the Conservative Party has confidence, doesn't have that sense of entitlement towards power. And helpfully, I guess also, because I'd set it in my own constituency in Ashfield, those red wall mining constituencies, they actually did trend towards the Conservatives even in 2017. So something was happening in Battersea and Canterbury, but the trend in my town where I was set was very much against the national average. So the play could sort of still contain this problem between how you win the university towns and how you win the mining towns. But it was a dicey one for a second.
It's fascinating. I never got to watch it, and now Adam, chair, is asking, when is Labour of Love going to be released on NT Live? He's desperate to watch it again. I really want to watch it again. Do we know? Is there any plan to re-release it?
There isn't yet, but let me ask, because I think it wasn't filmed by NT Live. It was an entirely different company and theatre. So, but I think we did record it in some capacity. And in this climate, there might be a way to persuade people. It's often very complicated for the reasons you acknowledged earlier, to share work for free, which it should be, but make sure people get paid, which they should be. And I'm not talking about me. But I would love to share that. I would love to share that play. It was great fun. I mean, it was an unapologetic West End comedy. There were gags, but it was set in a constituency office, and it was basically a love story between an MP and his agent. And a constituency agent I find such a fascinating character. Basically the people who hold the fort while the MP goes off and does all the glamorous stuff in London. And I think that dynamic was really fascinating to explore.
We've got another one on Labour of Love. There's a lot of appreciation for that play. James Potts, who was involved in devolution and local power and works for the GLA, is asking, what happened to David Lyons from Labour of Love? Did he lose his seat in 2017, or did he win only to quit Labour and join Change UK? And he have survived in 2019? He clarifies, I used to work for a Nottingham MP, so I really loved the play. When I went to see it, the office looked exactly like ours.
Yeah, we stole the office aesthetic entirely from what was Gloria Di Piero's Ashfield office at the time, in all the bad floor tiles and crappy blinds.
They all, it's like they have to look crap. I've never done one of these.
And they should do. They shouldn't look all Silicon Valley. You need to ground our members of Parliament. And it was the greatest pleasure when I walked into the West End, this glorious Victorian West End theatre, and saw a shitty office in Ashfield pollute the stage. It's like, yeah, this was great. What happened to this fictional character? Well, he definitely didn't join Change UK, because even though the agent was more on the Tony Benn spectrum and the MP was more on the Blair spectrum, he is part of that centre-left tribe in the Labour Party, which I think, even though a lot of them were told to leave when they were pushing back against the Corbyn project, I spoke to Gloria a lot, my MP in Ashford at the time, and she talked a lot about how we win over traditional Labour voters in these mining towns, and how you balance the radicalism of Corbynism with the pragmatism of these people's lives. She said she would never leave the Labour Party, even if the Labour Party kicked her out, because it runs through her like a stick of rock. It's not something she could have ever given up, even if she felt it gave up her. And I like to believe that that the character, fictional MP, has that level of integrity, that no matter what, no matter in failure, he would still pay his subs and turn up to local meetings.
Yeah. We've got Bambo Charalambos asking a question, actually. We did an event with him not long ago at all, a few days ago. He's asking, how much research did you do for the story of Walter Harrison and Bernard Wetherill, and the pairing arrangement for the confidence vote in this House? People don't always appreciate the work of the whips. Pairing and nodding through still goes on.
It's the favourite story I've ever discovered in my life. I can't take too much credit for discovering it, because there was a very small, quiet Beat Radio 4 documentary about 15 years ago, where Mark Darcy, the BBC reporter, met Walter, and Walter sort of hinted at this thing that was happening. But I do take credit for sort of popularising it and putting it in front of a mainstream audience, because no one had ever talked about it, and I don't know why. And actually, some of the whips who came to watch the play had no idea that this experiment, this agreement had happened, and they were in the whip's office at the time. So yes, for those who didn't see the play, basically it involves the vote of no confidence in 1979, when the Callaghan government was going to fall. If they did fall, there'd be an election and Margaret Thatcher would come to power. It was wafer thin. Basically, it was 310 to 310, and there was one vote in it. And this tragic, heartbreaking story of a very old Labour MP called Doc Broughton, who was stuck in Leeds, who was dying, and just really wanted to come. And that one single vote would have allowed the Callaghan government to at least survive into the future, possibly over the summer, and then who knows. And the whips had this impossible debate about, do we bring him down? What if he dies on the M1? What do we do? This is devastating. So Walter Harrison, the deputy whip of the Labour Party, asked Jack Wetherill, the deputy whip of the Conservatives, to honour this agreement that had been suspended, which is the pairing agreement. You need to take someone out if the doctor can't come. And this beautiful thing happened, and I just couldn't believe it, where Wetherell, despite it destroying his career and losing the chance of getting Margaret Thatcher into power in that instance, understood that some things are more important than short-term gain, and that if you don't have principles, you don't have anything. He agreed to stand himself out, and Walter Harrison was so devastatingly moved by that offer, he couldn't accept it. So they agreed that the conversation never happened. They would never talk about it, not for many decades, ideally until one of them had died, and they didn't even tell their colleagues in the Whip's office. And the Callaghan government lost by that one single vote, and as you know, the rest is history. So as an endpoint to a play, Jesus Christ, that does it for you. You just have to work towards that. But in researching that, I remember I went down, I just loved this side of it. I went down to Canterbury University and spent a few days inside Jack Wetherell's papers, smelling the smoke of the 70s as they wafted out and all the whiskey and the cigars. I found the bit of paper where he, often in pairing discussions, they would write down what the ask was and what the agreement was. And on that day, March the 23rd, 26th, 1979, he wrote down the words, no pairs were asked for, no pairs given. And even just knowing that was part of the myth making, that they decided to write that down in their pads and it not being true, was sort of beautifully chilling and wonderful and moving. And then, I got to meet Walter Harrison. I went up to his house in Wakefield less than a couple of months before he died. And I've got to be honest, I didn't actually handle my relationship with him well at first. I mistimed when I was going to speak to him. I'd spoken to Anne Taylor, the chief whip, the future female chief whip, and a few other people, but I was building up to Walter because I didn't quite know what the play was yet. And I mistimed it, and I've always remembered this lesson. The National Theatre announced the play, and that Philip Glenister in the very first production was going to play him. And that obviously got up to the Wakefield Gazette, and he heard about it, and I hadn't spoken to him yet, and I felt terrible. And his local Labour office emailed me to say he'd happily speak to you if you want. And because I normally take such pride in taking people with me, and I was so upset that this man who I really admired, I'd upset. So he gave me his number, and I called him, and I just remember that this is the guy who is renowned as being the most frightening whip of all time. And I felt like I was being whipped. I feel like I was being pulled into his
I'll vote, it's fine.
Whatever you want, I'll do anything. And I called him, and he went, hello. And I went, hi, it's James Graham. I'm writing a play about you. And he just went, you took your time. And I felt chills go through me, which was sort of thrilling, because I felt like that's what it must have been like to be a member of Parliament in 1974. Yeah. And then he forgave me very generously, invited me up. We had a day together, eating mince pies and cups of tea in a winter morning. And he showed me all of his papers, and I got under the skin of his life and his world. And it was just the greatest privilege. Like it moved me beyond belief. And he didn't have to do that given everything else. So it felt extraordinary to bring to life these people who I think most people have never heard of, but are absolutely fundamental to the running of the Labour Party and the winning of Parliament.
It is incredible. Did he ever manage to watch it? Because he was very, very old at the time. And
he was. So no, he didn't, unfortunately. His family did, but he died, I think, a couple of days after we opened. So yeah.
So sad. I have to admit, this house, a young conservative friend of mine took me to watch it before I had even joined the Labour Party. Okay. So he was like, you're left wing and I'm right wing, so let's go watch this thing together. And I fell in love with Baroness Taylor, Anne Taylor, who is now Baroness Taylor. Just such a wonderful character. It's such a shame because the play has so few female characters. The 3 or 4 that there are just so incredible, such an inspiration. Well,
I wouldn't have been able to write the play without Baroness Taylor. She's been she opened up a whole very secret world. I mean, whips are just really hard to get into, and she was incredible, so impressive.
Excellent. So Carla van der Sluis asks, what's your advice to anyone who fancies using their lockdown free time to try writing for performance?
Oh God. Well, I feel like I can't, because I'm really struggling to write in lockdown. I found it really, really, really hard to be consistently productive and creative. And I think that's probably okay. I mean, we should be kind to ourselves, and it's, we're all just worried for the people that we love in the world around us. But I would say, I mean, where do you start? I think that I think finding a clear rhythm is really important, but that's just for me. I don't really go in for the whole start writing at 10 o'clock at night, work through the early hours of the morning with a candle and wine. I treat it like it's a job, and this is the slot, and this is the slot I'm going to protect, and I'm going to try as best I can, and I often fail, but as best I can to not be online, not to be responding to messages.
Mm. And, are you a morning person, or?
Yeah, I try and get up really early. It's getting later and later and later as I get older and older, but it's probably my working class Protestant guilt about not having a proper job. But like my mum still has 2 jobs. She gets up at 6. She works in a school in the day and in a warehouse till 10 o'clock at night. And here I am making up stuff for a living. So I think I feel like I feel like I need to feel, in order to be creative, I feel like I need to be ahead. I need to wake up before you do, and therefore I feel like I can play. If I feel behind, I feel this overwhelming guilt that sort of limits my playfulness. So yeah, just protect some time and maybe try the morning. Maybe try those early hours of the morning where it feels free and it's sort of inconsequential. Like if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. You just got up early. And I just always think the best rule I can always give for if you're starting out writing is the most open secret in the world is that everybody's first drafts are terrible. Just awful. Like if you read the first drafts of anything I wrote, it will be embarrassing. And the difference between people who are playwrights or screenwriters and those who aren't, I'm convinced, is just the people who persevered through that self-humiliation and got to the second draft. And then once you get to the second draft, after you've left it for a couple of days and you have this imperfect thing, it becomes more freeing, it becomes more possible. You sort of know what it is, you've made some discoveries, and then you just start again. And it's glorious, and it really starts to feel like you're moving with momentum. And so yeah, just don't beat yourself up if your dialogue is going to be so crude, so reductively simple. The themes you're going to wear on your sleeve, it will be too long, and just accept that it's not meant to be perfect at the beginning.
Have you seen Portrait of a Lady on Fire? Have we got to that? Because no,
I'd love to.
It explains that visually really well, because it kind of first half of the film she makes this portrait as a painter, throws it aside, and then the second half does it again, and then that's the final painting. It explains that really nicely. Matt Dickinson, who is a member of our exec team and a comms person, he asked, very interested to hear what your literary, playwright, cinema influences growing up and today are. How have they changed through time?
Wow, well, you just mentioned a great piece of French independent cinema, and I'm going to go really lowbrow to, I did not have high taste when I was growing up. I watched a lot of soap operas. I watched a lot of gritty northern British dramas, like from people like Jimmy McGovern and Sally Wainwright, Paul Abbott. So it was mainly TV. It was mainly quite naturalistic northern stuff. But then as I got into theatre and new writing, I mean, the first play I ever saw in London was by Roy Williams, who's this incredible Black British playwright, one of the most successful, who writes working class dramas set in urban environments. That was at the Royal Court. It's called Fallout. And I'd just never seen a play do that before, feel that way, feel like it wasn't a bit of heritage, that it was punching through the wall of the audience and saying that it can be contemporary and about now. Converse to that, I also love Alan Bennett and those northern sounding, possibly quite twee, and yet not as twee as you think, often they're really dark and quite revolutionary when it comes to sexuality or human behavior. Yeah, those kind of things. I would love to impress you with my vast European knowledge, but it's quite lowbrow.
It's great. I grew up loving Jumanji and Indiana Jones. You know, like it's cool.
No, they're the most well-structured pieces of art you could ever find. They're glorious.
And yeah, in fact, like I think one of the strongest things about the UK is that it still has maintained like this sort of regional theatre tradition, which you know, a lot of European places just don't have at all. So Amy Swain, long time us, in terms of musicals versus plays, is there an in-between in which we can further utilize instrumentalists and other performers in theatres?
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with that. There just shouldn't be rules, and I resent any artificial wall that's put up between two forms and says this is this and this is that. We've tried to exploit the musical forms in my plays, whether it's dance, whether it's, we had a live band in this house for no reasons, the House of Commons, but we had a 1970s punk band because what we wanted it to feel like was sort of an anarchic kind of crazy parliament. And I'm sure there's even an even more fluid merger of forms and styles than that, without a doubt. And we also have to be honest that like musicals are incredible in terms of there is a highbrow, lowbrow snobbery towards them, which I resent. But in terms of form and style, they're often sometimes the most inventive and the most free in terms of their method of expression than a serious straight play. And it's populist. It appeals to a commercial audience. You get coach trips from Doncaster coming to see a musical more than you ever would come and see one of my plays. So I'm dabbling in my own musical at the moment. I know it may not work, but I think it will work. Well, it's by an up and coming.
Are you on draft one or?
No, I wish I'm on draft 0.5. It doesn't feel like I'm even at draft one yet, but I'm working with some very talented people. The guy writing the music is this up and coming artist called Elton John. I'm predicting big things for him in the future.
Fantastic.
We're very lucky.
Yeah, I've heard of something about Rocket Man.
Yeah.
I think I'd speak for the owners when I said like Hamilton is one of the best things that happened to American history in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Right. Antonio Wise asks, your works help us empathize with seemingly panto villains, for example, Murdoch, Cummings, Charles Ingram. Is that something you consciously set out to do? He's a Labour councillor and ex-PPC. He says, my wife and I are unashamed super fans.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for spending your Friday night with me. It is, yeah, it's completely conscious. It's I don't know whether the right word is sympathy or empathy or something in between. I didn't vote the way that Dominic Cummings wanted me to vote, and I don't agree with Rupert Murdoch's philosophy in the world, but I feel like it's a valuable exercise to play devil's advocate sometimes with your own prejudices and just go on the journey of going, not endorsing or agreeing with them, and so not agreeing with the malign impacts on people's lives that maybe their politics have had. But I just don't know how we either understand it, beat it, fight it, without treating it seriously and not two-dimensionalizing it and just demonizing it. Yeah. So with Rupert Murdoch, I mean, it helped that I wanted it to be an origin story for what would later become his empire. So by default, you're depicting a younger man in his mid-30s who has all the anxieties and the uncertainties, the fears and the doubts in himself that other people do. And I believe that's true. So he seems more rounded and less on a journey towards something. So that's naturally more empathetic. And look, let's not pretend he's not privileged and part of the establishment, but he had his own wars to fight. There was mild racism when he came here because of his Australianness, and there was he was mocked and humiliated. I'm not elevating it.
For sure.
You know what I mean? So that naturally lends just a reminder to go, yeah, that's interesting. And the basic principle is, I just think the best way to hold people to account is to give them the defense first. And then you know what you're dealing with. I'm not straw manning them. I'm not making up what I think their philosophy is. I'll let them tell me what we think it is, and then we'll push back. But I wrestle with the balance. I don't find it easy. And I spoke about this before. I wrestle with the balance of So Rupert Murdoch came to see the play in London and in New York, and I understood of course I understood the nervousness around that from the theatre community when that was reported, because I from the outside, and I would recognise that, they will go, well, if he's happy to come and sit and watch this play twice, not done your job, have you? And I wake up every morning going, maybe I haven't done my job. But it was a conscious decision to write a play that he would come and see, and then he would have to sit there listening to people advocate for that kind of news, popular news that reaches people. And then he would then also have to sit there listening to people going, you've polluted the news discourse, you've created a toxic environment that we will never recover from. He had to sit there and listen to that. And I would rather write a play where he can listen to that than just have the New York Times or just the Guardian readers come and get the world reflected back to them. I don't find it easy. I definitely don't get the balance right. And that's almost certainly true with Dominic Cummings as well. But the intention is a sincere one, to create a public space where everyone feels welcome and everyone gets heard, for right or wrong.
I mean, it is sort of a daily conversation that we have in the Labour Party and the Fabian Society. And it segues really nicely into Jack Clayton, who's in the international networks. We're on the last couple of questions. Thank you so much for staying.
That's right.
Sorry. So yes, Jack's asking precisely this. So over the last few years, there has been an increased political tribalism and hyper-partisanship. How have you found that as a creative political writer in an atmosphere where social commentary and even satire can face accusations of being biased?
Yes. It's often all I think about, and I both recognise the value of polemical work that acts as activism and advocates for a certain point of view. So I think that can be really inspiring and sometimes necessary if we think of theatre as a political weapon. Sometimes you just have to advocate. But I almost, for my own writing, I almost think that this sounds so wet, but I think almost the most radical thing we can sometimes do is be kind at this difficult time, and not try to send, not always try to send the audience out of the auditorium fuming and ready for war. That sometimes what we can do is use what I think is almost the last weapon that we have in the age of Netflix or social media, which is to lock people in a space for 2 hours and demand that they engage a more reasonable, calm, long-sighted, nuanced part of their brain to very complicated, complex problems. So I feel like, and even if that's just with something silly like quiz, I mean, just going, it doesn't really, apart from the individual personal trauma of that family, it doesn't really matter on a global scale whether they were innocent or guilty. I mean, it says something about our justice system. But the exercise is still the same as with Dominic Cummings or Rupert Murdoch. You're going, you think this already. Do you just want to briefly entertain the other thing? And then you can choose whatever you like afterwards. But do you want to just walk through the footsteps of somebody you wouldn't normally walk through? And would that be interesting? And so I think that feels like a really valuable exercise at the moment.
I mean, yeah, it is amazing. And it is precisely once one gets to know your work, it is that with you there's almost trepidation in that, because you know you will empathize with these people, right? It's kind of my problem with Brexit and Civil War. I'm like, God, I'll watch it and then I'll feel all conflicted about it.
But again, speaking specifically about the Labour Party, it was such a joy to it was a joy for me intellectually and ideologically to find two characters who believe different things, the left and the centre left, and just invest in them, even if I disagreed with them. I go, so what's the most generous version of their argument? What do they think they're doing that is positive and good? And I don't know why that can ever be an unhealthy exercise, because of going, I think we should all do that, and that's what the audience had to do as well. They would have to. It was interesting. I don't know whether any of your participants want to speak to it, but it was interesting that, and I was relieved that people on the Corbyn spectrum or the Tom Watson spectrum came to see the show felt like that they got the better account of their politics. So to represent, I was pleased that both sides felt like they won the argument because they heard themselves, and felt like it was a good account, but they were also made to listen to the other side as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So on the last couple of things. Someone asked a very leading, like, where do you sit on that left to center spectrum?
I'm not going to answer that, am I?
Exactly. No. It breaks the myth. Cecilia Eve from our international IPG group. Well said on strategic intervention and not letting the default trajectory play out. It's so true. How do you think the theatrical landscape has changed in terms of female representation, and what more could be done? Possibly off the back of an earlier question we were having.
It's just shocking and appalling that 51% of this country is female or identifies as female, and only 24% of plays on British stages are written by women. And the only explanation for that is systematic discrimination. It's just in the system, and we'll probably also have to ask uncomfortable questions about it being in the audience as well, and what they feel safe spending their money on and going to see. It's slowly improving. It's nowhere near getting quick enough. There should be a policy. I think on that, there should be a policy in any building or any theatre company to commission equal writers on all end of the spectrum, and stick to that and program that work. That can absolutely be achieved in the next couple of years, and should be.
I was going to say, because this exists in the BFI and it exists in quite a lot of film festivals, but I have not heard of theatres doing the same. Do you know of any that do that in terms of their?
There are public pledges to reach that target of 50-50 balance. It's an aspiration rather than policy,
right?
But
It's a pressure point right there. And our last question, which is possibly my favorite question, from Alistair Murray, asking, have you ever been worried about being sued by any of the real people depicted in your plays, or are they checked over by the lawyers first?
All the time. That's all I'm worried about. I don't know. I also, I'm in the privileged position of having no dependents and living on my own, and I'm a bit cavalier about all that stuff and go, look, I want to write stuff that is provocative and interesting and puts people on stage that haven't been put on stage before, including Rupert Murdoch. But then you also, you find yourself surrounded by the most amazing support system, particularly in theatre, where you get legal reads where they can advise you on what you can say and what you can't say. You're allowed creatively to push back on that and push that quite far. It's often almost journalistic principles. If I express a controversial point of view that Rupert Murdoch comes out of his character's mouth, they ask me for basically two sources that can back that up. And in that room there is some interpretation. But no, of course you do. You can't defame, you can't lie, you can't misrepresent. But that doesn't mean you can't challenge, you can't provoke, you can't question, and you can't scrutinise. And between those two things is a massive grey area, which I think actually makes us quite safe. And we would be irresponsible not to wade into that grey area, because what are we doing it for if not?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Listen, we've been going for more than an hour and a half. I'm conscious that it is Friday night and people do want to have a beer. Thank you so much, James.
That was so much fun. Thank you.
Honestly, I genuinely do think I speak for members. I have had so many a conversation about your plays and your work, and it's such a wonderful way into politics, especially for younger people. So just, yeah, a huge thank you from everyone. I'll do the slightly little plug. So if anyone's been wanting to watch it and can't, it's going to be on YouTube from tomorrow, or if you want to rewatch it for your enjoyment, that it'll be there too. We have got a whole bunch of stuff going on from lockdown, because we're all massive nerds and have nothing else to do at the moment. So if you are like us and really want to get involved and want to do stuff, you can do so. For example, Labour's culture policy, all around culture war. I honestly, so many thoughts about Keir Starmer's leadership in relation to culture war. There's so much good stuff about Europe. We've got a pamphlet on artificial intelligence, environmental accountability, massive one, doing lots of stuff, redefining economic progress, education policy development, accessibility of politics, really interesting one from executive member who works at the Sutton Trust, an alternative health manifesto, and then a study on the effectiveness of mayors. Like, there's pretty much anyone one could ever want. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. We have got a weekly newsletter if you want to hear about it. And we do events every night. So just, join us and keep engaging. James, thank you so much. I'll probably be hassling you for some thing to do with our culture.
We should do events. Like, I should come and meet you when that's physically possible, and I would love if theatre survives this, the next time I have a play on, we should do a Young Fabians thing, and we should meet the cast and that kind of thing.
Believe me, we'll take you up on that. That's fantastic. So I think this is my first time using this, but Adam, I believe that we can just stop recording. I'm not sure how we end. This is one of those like awkward Zoom endings. Perfect, like he'll do it now. And so anyone who wants to contact us, info@youngfabians.org.uk. I seem to have it tattooed on my forehead now for how many times to say. So while Adam finds the way to log this, have you got a good weekend ahead? Are you going to be